"Off the bike, now!" barked the officer, yanking the elderly man backward as his motorcycle tipped over with a metallic clatter. The bystanders at the corner gas station gasped as the man, stooped, silent, and shockingly still, was shoved hard to the pavement. His hands trembled, not from fear but from age. Officer Brett Monroe, 32, towering and taut with false authority, kicked the rusted kickstand out of the way. "We got a report of an unregistered vehicle," he muttered to his partner, who started rifling through the bike's saddlebags. The old man didn't resist. He simply looked up, blinking at the blinding sun, expression unreadable. What nobody yet knew was that within minutes, a roar of engines would flood that quiet stretch of highway, and the sky itself would seem to shudder. Just 10 minutes earlier, Harold Deacon, 84, had left his cabin near the tree line on Route 94. It was a modest home, white porch rails, chipped wood, and a radio that still played big band tunes from a dial. Harold had ridden that same bike, a 1966 Triumph Bonneville, for nearly 5 decades. He'd fixed it up himself with spare parts, muscle memory, and a sense of craftsmanship long gone in today's world. Today, he was heading into town for the first time all month. His fridge had gone warm, and the hardware store had a generator on sale. Wearing a faded green army jacket and helmet with a cracked visor, Harold rode slow but steady, his spine straight, his expression serene. Harold had spent years avoiding crowds. He didn't talk much, not out of bitterness, but because the world had changed into something noisy, hasty, and reckless. His neighbors often called him the ghost on wheels, a respectful nod to his privacy. Only the local pastor, old Miss Langley, and the owner of the feed store knew his full name. Even fewer knew that Harold had once held stars on his shoulders, led men through jungles and sandstorms, and trained elite soldiers from 3 continents. But Harold never brought any of that up. His peace was hard-earned, his silence a sanctuary. Until today. The moment the officers pulled up beside the gas station, Harold had just unscrewed his gas cap. Officer Monroe leapt out like he'd cornered a fugitive. "License. Registration. Hands where I can see them," he barked. Harold, surprised but compliant, began pulling out his old wallet. The card was worn but valid. "This yours?" Monroe asked, holding up the license and tilting it sideways like it might crack open a mystery. "You're 84? You shouldn't be riding anything." Monroe sneered. His partner, Officer Lenny Krause, chuckled. "This thing looks like it belongs in a museum. What's it powered by, steam?" Monroe leaned in. "Get off the bike. Now." When Harold asked if he'd done anything wrong, Monroe didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed the old man's arm and pulled him off the motorcycle so roughly that Harold stumbled and hit the ground hard. The crowd nearby stiffened. One woman began filming. "This is too much," someone murmured. But Monroe was in too deep, and his ego wouldn't allow retreat. "We need to take him in," he said to Krause. "Vehicle code violation, maybe a psych evil. Who let someone his age ride around on this junk?" Harold stayed quiet. He didn't shout. Didn't plead. Didn't resist. Instead, he whispered only one word, to no one in particular. "Unwise." Across the lot, behind the counter at West Bend Gas and Goods, Jamal Reed had seen enough. The 26-year-old clerk, a former army mechanic, narrowed his eyes as he watched the officer yank Harold off the Triumph. Jamal had served under dozens of commanders, but only one ever shook his hand after every mission. Only one taught him how to repair diesel engines in a sandstorm. Only one ever called him son without condescension, Colonel Harold Deacon. Jamal stepped into the back office and shut the door. His hands shook slightly as he punched in the number etched into his memory from years ago. He wasn't sure if it would even still work. But if it did, someone big would answer. The line rang twice before a deep voice replied, "Forward command, Deacon protocol, verify identity." "Read. Jamal. 307 Support Battalion, Afghanistan Tour 2, FOB Grizzly." Silence hung on the line for a beat. Then the voice hardened. "Report." Jamal gave the address. "Is being detained. Roughly. No idea of who he is. Gas station off Route 94. 2 local cops." The voice cut in. "Understood." Then the call ended. Jamal leaned back, breath caught in his chest. He stared out the dusty window. Harold was still on the ground. The officers were arguing with each other now, looking uneasy as the murmuring crowd grew louder. Jamal walked back to the front counter and poured himself a cup of coffee with shaking hands. He didn't know how long it would take, but he knew help was coming. Outside, Monroe was trying to maintain control. "You don't answer questions, you get detained," he snapped at Harold. Kraus looked less sure now, glancing nervously at the onlookers filming them. "You sure we're not overdoing this?" he muttered. Monroe hissed, "Guy looks like he wandered out of a VA ward. For all we know, he's delusional." Harold blinked up at him with steady, unreadable eyes. "And for all you know," Harold said softly, "you're standing in front of the wrong man." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even a warning. Just a simple truth that cut through the noise. Monroe ignored it. He grabbed Harold's arm again. "We're taking you in, now." A full minute before the first engine noise hit their ears, the birds in the trees scattered. Leaves rustled and distant dust rose into the air beyond the tree line. Kraus looked up, puzzled. "What's that?" The rumble deepened. Then headlights appeared over the hill, bright, square, and military. First 2 hums, then 6, then a full convoy. The air began to shake. The crowd stepped back. Monroe froze, hand still gripping Harold's sleeve. A dozen hums rolled into the gas station lot, forming a perimeter. The lead vehicle skidded to a stop in a cloud of gravel. Soldiers jumped out in unison, boots hitting the ground like thunder. A man in full fatigues marched forward. "All units hold position," he bellowed. Then, locking eyes on Monroe, "Release him. Now." The officer's name tag read Major Lennox, and the air shifted around him. The soldiers stood tall behind him, their faces grim. Kraus took one step back, sweating. Monroe squared up, uncertain. "Who the hell are you?" he asked. Major Lennox stepped closer. "Sir, you are detaining a decorated war hero, former battalion commander of the 12th Special Operations Unit, recipient of the Silver Star, Legion of Merit, and 2 Distinguished Service Crosses." His voice grew louder. "This man is Colonel Harold Deacon, and you are about to make the biggest mistake of your career if you don't let go right now." The word colonel hung in the air like a thunderclap. The soldiers behind Lennox took a synchronized step forward. The crowd went silent. And for the first time that day, Monroe looked scared. Harold slowly pushed himself up from the pavement as the dust settled around the convoy. One of the younger soldiers instinctively stepped forward to offer a hand, but Harold waved him off with quiet dignity. His knees cracked as he rose, but his spine remained straight. His old army jacket fluttered in the breeze, the faded insignia now visible on the sleeve. The crowd stared in disbelief, cell phones still raised, catching every second of this unraveling drama. "You're a colonel?" Monroe stammered. Harold didn't answer immediately. Monroe's hands trembled now. His radio crackled with background noise from Central Dispatch, but he couldn't hear it over the pounding of his own pulse. "We didn't know," he muttered. "He didn't say anything." Lennox stepped forward. "You didn't ask. You saw an old man and assumed he was useless. That's the kind of decision that gets people hurt, in battle and in the streets." Kraus looked like he might throw up. A corporal approached Lennox. "Orders from command, sir." Colonel's record confirmed. "All units on standby. Do we press charges?" Lennox glanced at Harold, who was now adjusting the strap of his helmet, eyes locked forward. "No," Harold said firmly. "No charges. Just make sure they learn something today." Lennox nodded. "Understood, sir." A military medic approached Harold with a kit in hand. "Sir, you took a fall. Let me check you." Harold sat gently on the edge of a Humvee's bumper while the medic examined his elbow. "Just bruises," he muttered. Meanwhile, the officers stood awkwardly to the side. Kraus whispered to Monroe, "We need to call the captain. Now." But their radios had already lit up. Dispatch was trying to figure out why a military convoy had taken over a gas station in rural Belridge County. Back near the store entrance, Jamal was still watching, arms crossed. He gave a low whistle, eyes wide. "Told you," he said to a nearby teen who'd been filming the whole time. "Never mess with the quiet ones. Especially the ones who used to lead battalions." As the dust settled, Lennox turned to the civilians. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Colonel Deacon is a hero, and today was an unfortunate example of what happens when assumptions replace respect." A few in the crowd clapped. One woman lowered her phone, visibly shaken. "I thought they were going to hurt him," she whispered. "They did," said another man nearby, "until real soldiers showed up." Across the lot, Monroe and Kraus were pulled aside by a stern-faced army sergeant who began reading them a list of regulations about unlawful detainment of veterans. The sergeant's tone was ice-cold. The kind that made it clear that careers were now hanging by a thread. Major Lennox walked back to Harold. "We can arrange transport back home, Colonel." Harold shook his head. "I came on the bike. I leave on the bike. The young corporal nearby stared at the Triumph as if seeing it for the first time. That thing still runs? Harold grinned. Better than most people you know. Laughter rippled through the soldiers. Monroe looked down at his boots, humiliated, while Kraus kept his hands buried deep in his vest pockets. As Harold mounted the old Triumph and kicked the engine to life, the battalion instinctively formed a corridor. Uniforms lined both sides of the road. Salutes rose. And through the dust and silence, the worthless old man rode off, steadier than ever. At the Belridge County Sheriff's Department, Chief Lorraine Mattis was just settling into her office when the phone rang. She didn't recognize the number, but the tone on the other end was unmistakably military. Chief Mattis, this is Lieutenant Colonel Brandt from Fort Ellison. We need to discuss a situation that occurred on Route 94 involving 2 of your officers and one of our own, Colonel Harold Deacon. Mattis sat up straighter, pen frozen midair. Colonel Deacon, she repeated, already sensing the storm brewing. Yes, Brandt replied sharply. We have video footage, eyewitness reports, and a battalion commander who had to intervene publicly. We expect full cooperation with the disciplinary review. The Army will be coordinating with your office by end of day. The line went dead. Mattis exhaled slowly, her eyes narrowing. She reached for Monroe and Krause's files. An hour later, both officers were standing stiffly in her office. Monroe still looked defiant, but his voice cracked when he spoke. We didn't know who he was. Chief Mattis didn't blink. And that justifies throwing a man to the ground? An 84-year-old? Krause muttered, he looked fragile. We thought he might be a danger to himself. Mattis slammed a folder onto her desk. That fragile man trained more soldiers than either of you could count, including half the men who just marched you into humiliation. You don't get to profile someone based on age and a rusty bike. She stood, pacing. The military wants training implemented across all precincts in the state. And thanks to you too, we'll be the pilot department. Within days, a specialized training program was developed between Fort Ellison and Belridge PD. Officers from all ranks were required to attend, starting with Monroe and Krause. They reported to the base in full uniform, standing awkwardly among disciplined men and women in fatigues. Their instructor? None other than Major Lennox. Before we begin, he said in a booming voice, let's talk about perception and respect. He turned to Monroe. Officer, what did you see that day when you approached the man on the bike? Monroe swallowed hard. An old man, maybe unstable. Lennox nodded. What you didn't see was experience, service, and sacrifice. Because you didn't care to look. The room remained silent. The message was clear, next time, look harder. Meanwhile, Harold returned to his quiet cabin without a word. He parked the Triumph in the shed beside a box of rags and ammo cans. The porch light buzzed faintly in the early evening wind. He sipped coffee on the steps as the last rays of sun dipped behind the trees. For him, the incident was already history. He hadn't asked for intervention. He hadn't called anyone. But he felt something stir when that battalion rolled in, something he thought he'd left behind. That sense of brotherhood. Of command. Of being seen. As a hawk circled overhead, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. He wasn't planning on fighting any more battles. But if the world came knocking again, he'd still answer. In town, whispers about the gas station standoff spread like wildfire. Locals shared the videos, commented endlessly online, and even brought Harold pies and casseroles they left on his porch without saying a word. Jamal, back behind the counter, received nods from passing strangers. You knew him? They'd ask. He knew all of us, Jamal would reply, smiling. But the truest impact came at the station, where training videos now started with Harold's footage, an elderly man knocked down and rising with more dignity than those who'd shoved him. In classrooms, rookies were taught that respect isn't reactive, it's proactive. And in every training packet was a photo of Harold Deacon next to a Triumph bike, engine silent but legacy roaring louder than ever. It was a humid Thursday afternoon when Officer Monroe pulled his unmarked car onto the gravel path leading to Harold Deacon's cabin. He was no longer in uniform, suspended pending further review. His chest felt tight, his palms damp as he stepped out and approached the porch. The air smelled like pine and gasoline. The Triumph was visible near the shed, resting under a tarp now tied neatly at the corners. Monroe hesitated before knocking. From inside, Harold's voice rang out, "It's open." Monroe stepped into the modest home, eyes adjusting to the warm, low light. Harold sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a manual titled Field Maintenance for Tactical Units. He didn't look up. What do you want, officer? Monroe swallowed hard. Just a conversation. Maybe an apology. Harold closed the manual with a soft thud. Harold stood and walked to the coffee pot without a word. He poured 2 mugs and slid one across the table without sitting. You ever serve? He asked. Monroe nodded slowly. 2 years. National Guard. Didn't deploy. Harold nodded. Still counts. He Saturday, but I didn't see respect in your eyes that day. I saw control. Monroe flinched. I thought you might be unstable. I didn't mean to. Harold raised a hand. You didn't ask. You assumed. And in your line of work, that's the difference between safety and scandal. Between help and harm. Monroe looked down at his hands. I didn't see a colonel. I saw a burden. Harold nodded slowly. And that's exactly what's wrong with your badge. The silence stretched. I've been retraining, Monroe finally said. At Fort Listen. They've had to study old case files. Role-play scenarios. Even brought in veterans to talk about dignity. But none of it felt real until I came here. Harold took a slow sip of his coffee. You can't be taught humility in a classroom. That comes from being broken. Stripped. And choosing to stand anyway. Monroe nodded. I want to earn back the kind of respect I took from you. Harold stood and stepped toward the window. Outside, wind rolled gently across his overgrown lawn. Then start with others. Not me. Monroe followed his gaze. You'll never ride again without people saluting, he said softly. Harold smirked. I never rode for them. Back at the precinct, the new field training manual was finalized. It opened with a chapter titled The Deacon Doctrine, a case study on misjudgment, quiet strength, and the fallout of unchecked authority. Every new recruit read it. Every officer signed off on it. Ava Ramirez, a newly promoted sergeant, led her first class with trembling hands and a confident voice. We're not here to protect the idea of power, she said. We're here to serve people, especially those who've already served us. She tapped the screen where Harold's photo appeared beside a military crest. If you ever forget that, you're not just failing them. You're failing yourself. The recruits sat silent. Respectfully. Attentively. And with the weight of history hanging in the air. Weeks later, Harold found himself sitting on a folding chair beneath the county fair's veteran tent. Rows of flags rippled behind him. Young cadets marched past in crisp uniforms, saluting as they passed. A small girl approached holding a homemade thank you sign. She handed it to Harold and smiled. Mom says you're the reason the soldiers showed up. Harold chuckled. Well, I didn't send for them. The girl tilted her head. But they came anyway. Her innocence carried more truth than she knew. Across the field, Jamal watched from his hot dog stand, nodding with quiet pride. In the parking lot, Monroe leaned against his car, arms crossed, still learning, still listening. And Harold Deacon, the man once yanked to the ground, sat tall as ever, because dignity, once earned, never rusts. Jamal closed up his stand just as the sun began to dip behind the hills, casting golden streaks across the fairgrounds. He carried a small box tucked under one arm, glancing toward the veteran tent where Harold still sat, speaking softly with a few old Marines. Jamal waited until they left before approaching. Colonel, he said with a respectful nod. Harold looked up, one brow raised. You still call me that? Jamal smiled. Always will. I owe you that much. He handed Harold the box. Inside, wrapped in cloth, was an old wrench with an engraved handle. Keep your hand steady and your word stronger, HD. Harold blinked. You kept it? Jamal nodded. You gave it to me before my first deployment. Said if I ever froze up, use it to remember where I came from. Harold exhaled deeply. And did you? Every single time, Jamal said, pulling up a chair beside him. When that convoy showed up, I wasn't surprised. I knew someone out there remembered who you were. Who you still are. Harold looked out at the fading daylight. I didn't want a scene. Didn't want revenge. Just peace. Jamal chuckled. Well, you didn't get peace. You got a battalion and a statewide training overhaul. They both laughed quietly, the kind of laugh only shared between people who've survived things together. Harold's fingers brushed the edge of the wrench. You ever wonder what you're really remembered for? Jamal nodded. Yeah. And I think you just found out. Harold leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of memory, pain, and pride settle into something quiet, but permanent. Across town, Officer Krause sat at home rewatching the gas station footage on his tablet. He paused on the moment the hums rolled in, the disbelief on his own face frozen in time. His wife stepped in from the kitchen. "You still on that?" Kraus nodded. "I can't stop thinking about it. We treated him like nothing. Like trash." She walked over and squeezed his shoulder. "You were wrong. But you're not still wrong. You're learning." He stared at the pause screen. "I want to meet him. Face to face. Not in uniform. Not as a cop. Just as a man who made a mistake." His wife smiled. "Then go. But don't bring excuses. Bring respect." The following Sunday, Harold was repairing the shed roof when he heard footsteps in the gravel. He looked down and saw Kraus standing there, nervously holding a small paper bag. "I brought lemon squares," Kraus said, awkwardly. "My wife bakes when I mess up." Harold climbed down the ladder, wiping sweat from his brow. He gestured toward the porch. "You didn't have to." Kraus followed him silently, setting the bag on the table. "I came to say I was wrong. About everything. I judged you. Mocked you. Treated you like a burden when you were anything but." Harold poured 2 glasses of water. "And what did you learn from that?" Kraus looked up. "That respect isn't about knowing someone's rank. It's about knowing they matter, even when you don't understand why." Harold took a sip of water and nodded slowly. "That's a lesson some people never learn. You still wear the badge." Kraus hesitated. "On suspension. Pending review. But I'm not sure I deserve to put it back on." Harold leaned back, his chair creaking. "You're right. You don't. Not yet." Kraus blinked, but Harold continued. "But maybe one day, if you carry that weight honestly, without hiding from it, you might earn it back." Kraus stood. "Thank you, sir." Harold watched him go, then turned back to the shed. The roof wasn't finished yet. But some repairs had already begun, quiet ones, beneath the surface. The kind that didn't require nails. Just truth. 2 weeks later, Harold found a formal-looking envelope wedged between a bag of chicken feed and the latest seed catalog in his mailbox. The return address read, Department of Veterans Affairs, Washington, D.C. He opened it slowly, scanning the dense print until his eyes landed on the line that mattered most. "You are hereby invited to speak as guest of honor at the National Veterans Leadership Summit." For a moment, Harold stood frozen, letter trembling in his hands. He hadn't spoken publicly since his retirement 25 years ago. Never sought recognition. But someone, somewhere, thought his quiet dignity was worth amplifying. At the bottom of the letter, scribbled in pen, was a single handwritten note. "The country finally sees what we forgot to honor. General R. Langford." Harold folded the letter carefully and stepped back inside. Inside the house, he placed the letter on the mantel next to a faded photo of his late wife, Edith, taken during his last deployment to Germany. He looked at her smiling face, framed in uniform just like his, and whispered, "Looks like we've been drafted again." That night, he sat at the kitchen table drafting what might be his first public speech since retirement. The words didn't come quickly. But when they did, they flowed like muscle memory, about respect, silence, identity, and the quiet strength of those who choose not to boast but to serve. He didn't write to impress. He wrote to remind. He wrote for the young officers who hadn't seen what silence hides, and for the old warriors who'd gone invisible long ago. When the day of the summit arrived, Harold was escorted to the podium in a modest navy blazer, his lapel decorated not with medals, but a simple brass pin bearing the insignia of his original battalion. The whole fell silent as he stepped up to the microphone. No teleprompter. No aide. Just Harold. He cleared his throat and looked out at the sea of uniforms, suits, cadets, and press. "I've been mistaken for a lot of things lately," he began. "A stranger. A threat. A nobody." The crowd held its breath. "But the truth is, I'm not the exception. I'm the reminder. That the measure of a person isn't the shine of their shoes or the sound of their voice, but the weight of what they've carried, quietly." Applause didn't erupt, it built. Like thunder slowly rolling in from a distant storm. By the time Harold stepped down, several generals had risen to their feet. His speech was printed in newspapers the next morning. On talk shows. Uploaded to YouTube. Jamal watched it from his phone while restocking shelves. Kraus watched it with his wife in stunned silence. Even Monroe, in the middle of another mandatory retraining course, paused the video halfway through and walked outside to sit with his thoughts. Harold hadn't scolded anyone. Hadn't named names. He'd simply told the truth, with the kind of calm power that couldn't be taught, only earned. And somehow, that struck deeper than outrage ever could. Back in Belridge County, a mural began to take shape on the wall of the police precinct. It depicted Harold's triumph roaring through a corridor of saluting soldiers, the sun rising behind him. Below it, in bold script, the artist painted Harold's closing words from the summit. Respect isn't owed because of age or rank. It's owed because everyone carries a story you haven't heard yet. Every officer had to stand beneath that mural at the start of each shift, a silent reminder of the line they walked, and the man who taught them how to walk it better. Meanwhile, Harold stayed away from the cameras. Away from the interviews. He returned to his shed, his garden, and his solitude. But something had shifted in the world. This time, it remembered him. Late one autumn afternoon, as crimson leaves drifted across Harold's driveway, a knock echoed softly at his front door. He opened it to find a young cadet in uniform, barely out of her teens, clutching a folded newspaper under her arm. "Sir, I hope I'm not intruding." Harold studied her a moment, then stepped aside. "Come on in." She introduced herself as Cadet Malia Grant from Fort Allison's leadership program. Her eyes gleamed with nervous energy and something deeper, gratitude. "I read your story," she said, unfolding the paper that showed the mural at the precinct. "I was ready to quit," she continued. "My instructors said I didn't have the voice for command. Then I watched your summit speech, and I realized strength doesn't have to be loud." Harold's face softened. "You're right. Loud fades. Steady lasts." They sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, two generations separated by time but bound by purpose. Malia spoke of training pressure, of fighting assumptions in a male-dominated space. "Everyone tells me I don't look like a leader," she said quietly. Harold tapped his chest. "They told me I didn't look like a survivor." She smiled. "But you are." Harold nodded. "And so are you. You don't have to prove it to anyone. Just carry yourself like you've already earned your space. That's how you make them believe it." Malia clutched her journal tightly, as if trying to hold on to the moment. "I'll remember that," she said. "I promise." He looked at her, saw resolve in her eyes, and knew she meant it. Before she left, Malia pulled a worn patch from her bag. "This was my father's," she said, handing it to Harold. "He served under you in '96. He always said you saved his unit from an ambush outside Jalabad." Harold took the patch in his hands, stunned. "Stephen Grant." Malia nodded. "He died in 2008. I joined the program in his memory. I think he'd have wanted you to have this." Harold's throat tightened. He was a good man. Brave. Smart. Too young. He pinned the patch to a small bulletin board near his front door, among faded maps and campaign pins. "You're carrying him forward," he said. "And now, maybe, you're carrying a piece of me too." Malia saluted him sharply. "With honor, sir." After she drove away, Harold sat alone in the porch chair, staring at the stars slowly blinking to life. The world had grown strange over the years, faster, louder, less patient. But it still had room for grace. He'd never asked for recognition. Hadn't wanted spotlights. Yet the impact of that single day outside a gas station kept rippling outward. People who never would have listened were now listening. Cadets were learning. Officers were reflecting. And maybe, just maybe, fewer strangers would be yanked to the ground for looking like no one important. He sipped his coffee and whispered, almost like a prayer, "Don't forget again." In the following months, Harold received dozens of letters. Veterans thanking him for speaking up. Young officers apologizing. Schools asking him to visit. He answered each one by hand. Not with lectures, but with stories. Sometimes humorous, sometimes haunting. He never preached. Just shared. One envelope held a single photograph, a group of soldiers in desert fatigues, arms around each other, and at the center, Harold, decades younger, smiling beneath a dust-streaked helmet. The note on the back read, "You saved us, sir. Thought you should know." Harold placed the photo beside his late wife's picture. "They're remembering," he whispered. Finally. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed Harold's property, muffling the world into silence. One icy morning, while loading firewood into the cabin, Harold's knees buckled, and he collapsed against the porch rail. The pain in his chest was sharp, unrelenting. He crawled to the door, barely able to reach the phone. The next thing he remembered was waking in a hospital bed, wires running across his chest, the beeping of monitors syncing with his heartbeat. A nurse leaned in. "You gave us a scare, Colonel." Harold blinked, disoriented. "I've had worse mornings," he muttered. The nurse smiled, then added, "There's someone here to see you." Been waiting since dawn. Through the door walked Cadet Malia Grant, now in full officer blues, holding a small journal. "Sir," she said softly, "you once helped me find my voice. Now I'm here to return the favor." She sat beside his bed and opened her journal. "You always said stories teach best. So here's one." Over the next hour, Malia read excerpts from the letters Harold had received, veterans, officers, students. All of them describing the impact of his stand at that gas station, the training programs that followed, and how his legacy had reshaped law enforcement interaction with elders and veterans across multiple states. "You didn't just change a town," she said, "you redirected a culture." Harold listened, eyes glistening. "But the world's stubborn," he said. "It forgets." Malia leaned forward. "Then we remind it. Again and again. That's how movements live on." Harold reached out, his hand finding hers. "You'll do fine, Lieutenant Grant." Her smile said everything. After a few days, Harold was cleared to go home. Malia insisted on driving him, refusing to leave him alone on the icy roads. When they pulled up to the cabin, Harold paused. There, in front of his porch, stood a new flagpole, freshly installed, proudly flying both the American flag and his old battalion's banner. "Who?" he began. Malia shrugged. "Community effort. Jamal, Kraus, even Monroe helped install it. Said it was overdue." Harold stepped out slowly, cane in hand, and saluted the flags with aching pride. "Didn't expect this," he murmured. Malia smiled. "No one ever does. Until they finally see who they were standing in front of." The cold wind blew, but it couldn't touch the warmth of that moment. That night, Harold built a fire and sat wrapped in an old wool blanket, staring into the flames. His Triumph sat parked outside under the stars, untouched since the fall. He didn't need to ride it anymore. Its journey was complete. He thought about all the people who had crossed his path recently, some who'd hurt him, some who'd helped, and many who had simply never known who he was. And he realized something profound. The greatest battles weren't fought on fields, but in quiet moments when one chose dignity over vengeance, teaching over punishment. He hadn't won justice with a weapon, but with stillness. That was his legacy now. The next morning, an email went out from the Fort to Listen Leadership Program, announcing a new scholarship in Harold's name. The Deacon Honor Grant would be awarded annually to cadets who demonstrated quiet leadership, moral courage, and humility. Applications doubled within the week. The story of the gas station incident became required study material in multiple academy syllabi. And at the end of each class, instructors asked the same question: what would Colonel Deacon have done? Slowly but surely, his influence shaped a new kind of strength, one that didn't need to shout to be heard. One that stood, even when pushed down. Spring brought new life to Belridge County, blooms along the roadside, robins in the pines, and an official invitation that arrived by courier. The White House was hosting its annual Medal of Civic Valor ceremony, and Harold Deacon's name was printed in bold beneath the seal. At first, he considered declining. But Malia called that night and said simply, "Sir, this one's not just for you, it's for every quiet warrior who was never seen." So Harold packed his old uniform, had it pressed, and boarded a military transport plane arranged by Fort to Listen. When he arrived at the nation's capital, an aide handed him a note. "You've reminded us what leadership really means. See you on stage. POTUS." Harold chuckled. That's a first. He stood at the podium in a hall full of generals, senators, and service members. Cameras flashed, networks streamed live, but Harold spoke plainly. "I never wanted medals," he began. "What I wanted was for men and women in uniform, past and present, to never be treated like shadows. Like burdens. Like ghosts." The room hung on every word. "Dignity," he continued, "doesn't come from rank. It comes from how we treat others, especially when no one's watching." The president rose and pinned the medal to Harold's chest. The crowd stood in thunderous applause. As he stepped down, Malia met him at the bottom of the stairs, saluted crisply, and whispered, "Mission accomplished, sir." After the ceremony, Harold declined the gala dinner. Instead, he and Malia found a quiet bench outside beneath a line of cherry blossom trees. "I still don't like crowds," he grunted. Malia laughed. "And yet the whole country keeps showing up for you." He looked toward the Jefferson Memorial in the distance. "Funny how it works. You stay quiet long enough, and the world eventually asks what you have to say." They sat in silence for a while, comfortable and unhurried. Before they left, Malia reached into her bag and handed Harold a new leather-bound journal. "For the next chapter," she said. He accepted it without a word, but his eyes said everything. Back home, the seasons passed with quiet rhythm. Harold tended his garden, watched his cows graze, and answered the occasional letter from a cadet who'd seen his mural or read his speech. But he didn't chase legacy. He returned to the life he'd always loved, simple, grounded, undisturbed. Occasionally, a stranger would stop by the cabin with a story, a question, or just a thank you. Harold always listened. Sometimes he offered advice. Sometimes just coffee. But every single person left with more than they came for. Because Harold Deacon didn't teach with rules. He taught with presence. And that presence stayed with you long after the visit ended. On his final birthday, the town held a small ceremony at the new Harold Deacon Veterans Center. A bronze statue stood at the entrance, Harold on his triumph, saluting quietly. The plaque read, "To those who serve silently, we see you." Jamal gave a speech. Malia read a letter from a new class of officers. Monroe and Krause stood in uniform, changed men. Harold spoke last. "I was called worthless once," he said. "But here's the truth, no one is, if you take the time to learn their story." And with that, he tipped his hat, mounted the Triumph one last time, and rolled down the road between saluting flags. Not for glory. Not for redemption. But because the road still needed riders like him. Enjoyed this story? Then you're just getting started. Tap subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss another powerful tale like this. Stories that hit hard, stick with you, and remind the world what real respect looks like. Subscribe now for more unforgettable stories, only on this channel.